So in this presentation, we're going to look at the general anatomy of a synovial joint. All synovial joints share some common features that are really integral to understanding how they work, how they add stability, while also allowing a large amount of mobility. So in this presentation, we'll learn the general structure of a synovial joint. Okay, so synovial joints are really where I want to spend the majority of the time. Synovial joints are going to be joints that are freely movable. They, when I say freely movable, doesn't necessarily mean they have a large range of motion or that they have range of motion in multiple planes, but it means that they have a significant amount of motion and the bones are not directly united. They're allowed to, the surfaces of the bones are allowed to move in relation to one another. So a synovial joint is a joint where there's two or more bones and they are separated by a space called the joint cavity. You'll also see that they're called a diarthrosis or a diarthrotic joint. And most have a fairly substantial amount of movement, but they all have some amount of movement. But again, not all of them have a lot of movement, but they all are characterized by this space between the bones. There are a number of different types of synovial joints in the body. There's 6 classifications. You can see them all in this picture. They're also discussed in your textbook. But again, they are named basically due to the shape of the bones that articulate. So again, if we have 2 flat surfaces that articulate with one another, then we call that a plane synovial joint. If we have one side of the joint is shaped like a socket, the other side is shaped like a ball, then we call it a ball and socket joint. So we're going to take a look at these different types of synovial joints on the next few slides. So let's start by taking a look at the general anatomy of synovial joints. So when we look at the specific joints in the body, we're going to see that all synovial joints have these same basic features. Although they may be very different from one another, we see these same basic features. The first, as I said already, is the fact that there is some joint space. So there is space between the bones. So it's an open space. It is filled with fluid, but there is a space between the joints. Now, in this picture, the space is fairly large. There seems like there's a lot of fluid in there. That's not normally the case. Typically, there's a small amount of synovial fluid and not a lot of space, and the bones would actually be, the cartilage of the bones would be touching. But the general anatomy of a synovial joint includes this joint space. The space is created by the articular capsule. So around the entire joint is this membrane. It's a connective tissue, fibrous type tissue like ligaments, but basically there's this fibrous capsule that encases the 2 bones and creates this internal space or this internal environment. So we can see it here. Again, this is a cross section, but this would be a cross section of the capsule. And again, that capsule will run the whole way around the joint. The outer portion of the capsule is going to be this fibrous material that's like ligaments, fairly strong, a lot of collagen. The inner layer is what's called a synovial membrane. The synovial membrane is going to produce synovial fluid. The synovial fluid is produced by the synovial membrane. It's a small amount of fluid that's present in all of our synovial joints that works like an oil. It's basically going to be a very good lubricator, so it makes the joint surfaces slippery because it's going to be coating the edges of the ends of the bones. It also coats the synovial membrane and the capsule. It also will coat any cartilage structures that happen to be in the joint. It is very similar in feel to a raw egg white. So next time you make eggs, get a little bit of the egg white between your fingers and you'll see it acts as a very good lubricant. It's very rich in a number of substances, but including oxygen and some nutrients. And it is a way that we can get nutrients to some of the joint structures, which we'll talk about. But it's primarily there to decrease friction and act as a shock absorber between the bones. The bones are also going to be covered with articular cartilage. So we don't have bone touching bone. We basically have this again, very smooth, somewhat spongy cartilage that lines the surface of the bones. Now it's just a thin layer, but it's much smoother than bone would be. So that, in combination with the synovial fluid, helps to decrease the friction between the bones when they move. There are potentially other structures in the joints, but not all joints have these structures. But all synovial joints are going to have that articular space, the joint space. They'll have that articular capsule, and that has synovial fluid. Okay. There also, we'll see that there's 2 or more bones, and they're lined with again, this cartilage, hyaline cartilage. In some joints, we have cartilage structures. So the cartilage structure has different names, but a number of our joints have what's called a meniscus. A meniscus is a cartilage pad or ring. It's made of fibrocartilage. We find menisci, or again, these kinds of cartilage structures in the knee, in the jaw between the mandible and the temporal bone, in the wrist. We see them in a number of places. These menisci, or fibrocartilage structures, are going to also assist with shock absorption. They will guide the bone's movement, so they'll help to keep the bones interlocked and in a good, stable position. And they will help distribute forces, in the case of the knee in particular, over a much larger surface area, again, hopefully preventing the formation of osteoarthritis, etc. There often are tendons that cross joints, synovial joints, often many tendons that cross synovial joints. And please remember, a tendon attaches a muscle to a bone. So tendons are associated with muscles and are going to direct the pull of a muscle to a bone, again, pulling or tugging on a bone. Tendons can add stability to a joint. Again, if the muscle is tight, it's going to certainly help to hold the joint together in most cases. But again, they aren't joining bone to bone, so they indirectly can contribute to the stability of a joint, and can contribute a very significant amount depending upon the joint. Ligaments are joint structures. They are there to hold the bones together. Ligaments connect bone to bone and are going to prevent excessive motion in a particular direction. We'll look at the ligaments, the major ligaments of all of the joints, when we go over each of the joints in in the future presentations. And then, not all joints, but a lot of joints have bursa or bursae. Again, have multiple structures that are called one is a bursa. Or is bursae. A bursa is a sac-like extension of a joint capsule, or a standalone sac of basically synovial tissue. So a bursa is a structure that typically is found between a tendon and a bone, keeps the tendon from rubbing on the bone. And a bursa is basically going to function like, if again, here's another experiment you can do in your kitchen. If you were to take a plastic bag and take that plastic bag, put it between your fingers, and rub your fingers together, you can see the kind of friction you can generate. And actually, you can do it without the bag first, and you can see that you can get your fingers fairly warm. I'm doing it now with my fingers, rubbing them together, and you'll feel some heat. If you go to your kitchen, take a plastic bag, add a little bit of olive oil to it, because that's a healthy oil, and put the plastic bag with the oil in it between your fingers and rub, you won't feel any heat generating, because the bursa and the oil in the bursa is going to decrease the friction. And that's what a bursa basically does, is it acts like that plastic bag with the oil in it, and now it decreases the friction of tendons rubbing on bones. We find them in a number of places around different joints. We'll talk about them when we look at the knee and the shoulder, again, where they're very prevalent. And generally don't even know they're there unless they become irritated. If the friction becomes too great, the bursa can get irritated and will get inflamed, and actually can get very painful. But basically, a bursa is basically a sac that has this, it's like the joint capsule. It has an outer fibrous structure and an inner synovial membrane structure that produces this fluid. But again, they help to reduce friction between, in most cases, tendons and bones. Well, what's up next is an examination of the different types of synovial joints, because while they all do share a common structure, the shape of the bones is going to be different from synovial joint to synovial joint, which will determine its motion. We're also going to see different alignments and laxity in the ligaments that protect these joints, and therefore different amounts of motion from joint to joint. So what we're going to do next is take a look at the different synovial joints in the body, and then we'll look at a couple examples.